Welcome to State of the State, the monthly roundup of policy and research for the state of Michigan, brought to you by the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State University and our friends here at Michigan State University Audio Studios. I'm Arnold Weinfeld, Associate Director for the Institute. Joining me, as always, are our co-hosts, Institute Director Dr. Matt Grossmann and economist Dr. Charley Ballard. Well, Matt and Charley, I think today we get to talk a bit about the juxtaposition between what's going on in the federal government and what's going on in the state government. Governor Whitmer gave her State of the State speech this week, and the legislature is yesterday threw money around like it's coming out of trees. So let's start with the congressional political circus, which, of course, started with the anointment of a new speaker after 14, 15 votes. Do we remember how many that was? And now that he's in position, the first thing that has come up is the debt ceiling. Right. And Treasury already taking some steps to make sure that we can pay our bills at least for a few months. Charley, you want to take a moment to explain to our audience about the debt ceiling and its importance at the federal level?
Right. The U.S. is actually the only country that has a statutory limit on how much debt we can run. Other countries, they just, okay, if we incur debts, we pay them, and it's not an issue. We have this debt ceiling. Now, I will say, I think it's a very artificial distraction because the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution has a section that says the public debt of the United States, quote, shall not be questioned. And to me, shall not be questioned means you can't hijack it. You can't hold it hostage. But we have repeatedly played this game, and no president so far has invoked the 14th Amendment. It looks like President Biden's team is not going to do that. So we will have some kind of showdown. Now, best case scenario, there's a lot of drama, a lot of headlines, and eventually we raise the debt ceiling. Worst case scenario, we came close to this in 2011. When we got kind of close to a default on the Treasury obligations, that would be catastrophic for the world financial situation and for our economy, because the U.S. Treasuries are the safest asset out there. Investors love having an asset that they believe is absolutely safe. If it becomes not safe, if we default on those obligations, boy, will that cause chaos in the financial markets. And it caused a fair amount of chaos in 2011 because it rattled investors. We didn't default, but there was a lot of angst in the markets, and the Treasury had to end up paying tens of billions more in interest than they otherwise would have. So I just hope we can get past this thing without going all the way down to the wire. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is that, like it or not, the world economy is very, very interconnected. I mean, we've learned that certainly through COVID, and every time these issues come up as well. Now, the U.S. economy right now still seems to be chugging along forward. I read the other day that GDP was up and employment is down. Per capita income is up, and yet there's still talk about fears of a recession. What's the mix there?
So the debt issue and the inflation and recession are connected, because during COVID, Congress put a lot of money out there. Some of which I would say was not particularly well vetted or controlled, and so that meant there's all this money, there's only so much stuff, so prices rise. Then the Federal Reserve, it falls to them to try to bring inflation under control. They've been raising interest rates. So far, as you say, the economy is still growing. I think that most analysts believe that in 2023, either we will have a soft landing, meaning very slow growth but no actual recession, or a soft-ish landing, meaning a mild recession. Right now, nobody is predicting a deep recession, and I hope those predictions come true. We'll see. I think most analysts think that we will have a couple of quarters of very, very slow growth, that employment growth will slow down. We'll find out next Friday what the latest jobs report is, but so far the job market has continued to grow. But likely we'll have a kind of a sluggish year. I'm hoping that it won't be a deep recession, but it's not likely to be a year of strong growth.
Well, certainly if you're in the tech sector, job growth has been a little bit more than just sluggish.
There have been
260,000 tech jobs in the recent past.
There have been some very highly publicized layoffs, big layoffs in the tech sector. On the other hand, Taco Bell is looking to hire 25,000 workers. Chipotle is looking to hire 15,000. So, it's a mix. But I do think the tech sector is a little unusual because they did so much hiring during the pandemic, a lot of which was, I think they admitted at the time, was unsustainable. And so they're retrenching somewhat now.
Of course, your mention of Taco Bell and Chipotle versus tech jobs brings to mind those that were making, near $100,000 moving out of the economy.
Or $250,000.
Or $250,000, and those that are going to be making maybe $25,000 moving in. So.
Fair enough. And, of course, as we've discussed in this podcast many times, that's a very long-term trend of higher wage inequality. We've seen that really for the last 40-plus years, and there's no indication that that's going to turn around anytime soon.
The discussion about the debt limit, even if they come to some agreement in the near future, what impact might that have on the economy moving forward? Is that going to even the notion of the United States defaulting on its debt limit, or the issues of cutting Social Security, which it seems like Kevin McCarthy had a bargain with his conservative caucus, conservative wing on. What might that do to investors?
The closer that we get to an actual default, the more likely it will rattle financial markets, and that will have ripple effects throughout the economy, all of which are bad, or almost all of which are bad. The cadre of the most strident Republicans in Congress, they don't have the votes to rip the guts out of Social Security. They don't have the votes to rip the guts out of Medicare. In fact, in a typical recent year, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the national debt, veterans programs, and defense are about 5 out of every $6 that the federal government spends. So, and the interest on the national debt might not be popular, but you got to pay it. The others, Social Security, is it popular? Tell me. It is wildly popular. Any member of Congress who votes to rip up Social Security, they should be getting ready to sell their house in January of 2025. I think that we're probably going to have a lot of drama. I think we're less likely to have a whole lot of substantive change. I will say, however, that although I say that the debt ceiling is unnecessary drama, it is still true that we got to get our deficit and our debts under control. We can't continue to run multi-trillion-dollar deficits indefinitely. Sooner or later, we will have a currency crisis if we do that. So we have to do it, but I think we need to do it instead of with one group in Congress holding the rest of them hostage. Do it the old-fashioned hard way, which is people meet in a room. It's messy. It takes courage and compromise. But we did it from 97 to 2000. We balanced our budget 4 years in a row. It can be done. I don't say it's easy, but it needs to be done. And we, the people, deserve no less than our elected leaders to just roll up their sleeves and do the tough work.
Matt, you've often talked about, as Charley was mentioning, programs that make up the social safety net, and how even though one party or the other may seek to change those, the public gets used to them, and they become really a part of our part of our economic fabric. I mean, would you agree with Charley that at the end of the day, programs like Social Security, Medicare, veterans programs, so on and so forth, even though you have a group of lawmakers in Washington that would like to see major changes to those programs, will they stay pretty much the same?
Well, certainly we tend not to see repeals of major popular programs, and when we see any changes, they tend to be paired with expansions in other areas. So the Obamacare reforms did make reforms to Medicare, cuts to Medicare, but they were paired with expansion in other areas. So that kind of thing is possible, but it tends not to jeopardize those major programs. But I don't think we can expect the low drama solution to materialize this time. It's not just a small group within the Republican Party. It's the entire Republican caucus that wants to use the debt ceiling as leverage to reduce spending commitments. It's Joe Manchin and some others in the Democratic policy wonk world as well. And the Republicans won in 2011 using the debt ceiling as leverage. They got major sequestration of future funding in exchange for supporting the debt limit. They lost in 2013. Remember, Ted Cruz tried to defund Obamacare, but they had a government shutdown a couple weeks before the debt ceiling, so that helped kind of allow them to go forward with it, but then relent when it wasn't working before the debt ceiling. But the parties have learned alternate lessons from those two episodes. The Democrats have learned never to let 2011 happen again, and the Republicans have learned never to let 2013 happen again. And that is not a recipe for an easy solution. If I had to guess, I would say there will be cuts to domestic discretionary spending, or at least some commission that is supposed to propose them and get them on a fast track, because that is sort of the only kind of odd man out from that 70% of the budget that the parties might have some agreement to rein in.
Is it possible that we might see more of a block grant system to the states reemerge, and that each state gets a chunk of money for those kinds of programs and then decides how to spend it? Might that be a way out of this?
Well, frankly, the states do not need money. One of the things that the large pandemic spending did was to send a lot of federal money to the states, and they are all still dealing with having all of that additional money to allocate today. One of the Republican solutions proposed is to actually pare back some of the unspent pandemic relief funding. So that's another potential way out, where the parties could say, we are making an agreement not to spend the things that haven't been spent yet from a year ago. But I don't know that you're going to see, any major reforms to these programs. Certainly, no big block granting of Medicare, Social Security, these big components of the budget.
Well, let's talk about the states for a second. Here in Michigan, the governor just gave her State of the State speech. You were talking about states having money. We did a forum last week at IPPSR where Rob Schneider of the Citizens Research Council noted that overall Michigan has a $9 billion surplus. $6 billion of it is ARPA funds, as you noted. That might get clawed back. But $3 billion of it alone is general fund surplus that we thought at the beginning of the pandemic things were just going to, crash and we'd have no money. And as we come out of the pandemic, we've got a $3 billion surplus. Let's talk about the State of the State speech first. Anything new that Governor Whitmer proposed in her State of the State speech? And how does that match up with what you're seeing in other states?
Well, you can definitely tell that the state has a lot of money, and obviously the Republicans did not expect to lose control of the legislature, because they left $9 billion for the Democrats to allocate. And the speech showed that means you can promise everything to everyone at this point. You can have tax cuts, you can have spending increases. And I've never seen accountants act like they are now, which is to say, sure, you can do that. Sure, you can do that. And you can do that too. Overall income tax cut, sure. Pension tax cut, sure. Earned income tax credit expansion, sure. Spending increases in childcare, sure. Eventually, we will run out of money, but there's such a large amount now that there is, appetite to increase, our allocations and to allocate them to tax cuts. There were some proposals for universal pre-K, which need a lot of details to come. There were some social issue proposals, but a lot of it was the same things that were proposed in the campaign and last year. It's just now everyone who hears them says, well, that actually has a chance to be enacted because there's a Democratic legislature for the first time in 40 years. So similar proposals, but with more of a chance to move forward because you got unified government and a lot of money.
Let's talk about a lot of money. Just last night, the legislature approved a $1.1 billion supplemental that's going to go largely for economic development to the MEDC and for specific projects. At the same time, you noted they approved tax cuts. I guess what they're calling now the working families tax cut, which is an expansion of the earned income tax credit, which has been argued for many years by many on both sides of the aisle. But they also finally passed a repeal of the retirement tax that Democrats have been promised as well. So what more do you think? And we've also got talk of an income tax rollback because we've got too much money. And as you note, we're spending money on programs. We have economists saying that maybe these surpluses are going to last through 2026. But certainly, as you noted, it does beg the question of sustainability moving forward if we put these in together. What more do you think we'll see out of this Democratic legislature?
Well, first, these are major changes, and they're major reversals of policy that was enacted just a decade ago on both the pension tax and changing the earned income tax credit. And it is kind of amusing that a new Democratic legislature, one of its first big acts is actually likely to be letting an across-the-board income tax decline go through because there's an automatic trigger built into prior agreements, and Democrats don't want to be caught passing something to say, no, we don't want that tax cut to go forward. So that's quite a bit on the table already. There was a conspicuous lack of mention of right-to-work repeal in the State of the State speech, which could either tell you that Democrats are being politically smart and putting those things on the table that they think are less controversial to start before they get to the things that will cause major conflict. Or it could be a sign that maybe the votes aren't quite as lined up as others believe. We'll just have to wait and see.
Gun safety was something else that was mentioned. I can't recall if the governor actually mentioned in the State of State, but certainly in a lot of documents, we're talking gun safety, universal background checks, so-called red flag laws, although I think the governor has labeled them as people protection laws as well as safe storage.
Well, and as she mentioned, she said, I think even Florida and Ohio have passed similar provisions. These are nationwide trends to some extent that we have these kinds of lighter gun regulations and gun regulations focused on the people who have access to guns rather than the types of guns that everyone has access to that are becoming more palatable nationwide. And the pre-K is also a nationwide trend. We're actually behind in increased allocations to pre-K that are occurring across the states. So yes, a lot of what she mentioned is these nationwide trends, and obviously we had our own mass shooting in Michigan. And it's still provoking interest in the legislature in doing something that seems to be responsive.
Charlie, speaking of tax cuts, let's get to one of your favorite topics, which is the pension tax repeal.
Yes. Well, I've said it before, and I'll say it again, but I recognize fully that I'm a lonely voice in the wilderness, and that I don't have much influence over public policy. But back before 2011, 95% of Michigan seniors paid no income tax, and on net, when you include various credits, they paid less than nothing in income tax. Then we went from extraordinarily generous to only very generous tax treatment of seniors, and now we're going to go back to extraordinarily generous. And I've always spoken against that. I think I'm even more. My complaint is even more valid now that I am actually retired and that I am receiving retirement income, which would be taxed under the old system and won't be taxed, or at least not much, under the new system. I don't think that citizenship ends when you retire, but as I say, that's a very lonely voice, and the AARP and other groups have been very vocal in pushing for this. I guess my point is, an affluent retiree shouldn't pay less tax than the nurse's aide who's struggling to make rent. So it's a very I think it's a very inequitable thing, but it just has huge momentum, and I don't think I can stop it. The earned income tax credit, on the other hand, I'm very much in favor of that, because it does go to low and middle income working families with children. That's where almost all the dollars go, and so those are the folks for whom I have a whole lot more sympathy than I have for myself, because I won't tell you how much money I have, but we're pretty well off.
And that was the one moment in the speech where the Republicans stood up to clap just as loudly as the Democrats, and we got Republican support for that earned income tax credit expansion in both chambers. But that might be a kind of a lonely piece where you really see Democratic and Republican agreement.
Yeah, the Republicans were not cheering when there was mention of reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, and a variety of other things.
Let's stay on this spending of money and tax giveaways and tax breaks. One of the things that was in this supplemental was more tax breaks again for economic development projects, whether they're singular projects like a paper mill in Escanaba, or there was another one for an economic development project elsewhere, and $150 million into the so-called SOAR fund. You know, and we've talked about this over the course of time about the use of taxpayer dollars as incentives for economic development projects. Very little in the way of research that they actually help to draw in projects, but yet if we were to end it, it's kind of like mutual assured destruction. Matt, any thoughts? I mean, you've dove into this topic quite a bit yourself.
This is a case where the research is relatively consistent, finding that these business tax incentives do not result in major increases in business income, any other outcome that states might be looking for, even accounting for the fact that other states would do it, much less if we could agree to some kind of ceasefire across the states to reduce these tax incentives, and certainly not if you compare it to other uses of the same funds, like general funding for infrastructure or education. So these, or tax cuts. So this is a case where the experts are in agreement, and the politicians said, no thanks, we'll go along with our traditional approach, because they like to be there at the ribbon cutting and like to be able to take credit for these projects. It's always amused at me that this occurs often just a couple weeks later. You know, we pass a major set of tax incentives for GM. GM announces a factory, the week later, and people say, oh, look at our immediate progress from passing that policy. And it's like, do you think a major company like what was ready to announce this but would have pulled back from it absent this amount of tax credit?
It had never crossed their mind until the tax credit came along.
So very heady times right now here in Michigan, it seems. Lots of money to be spent on programs, on projects. Any thoughts about the next 6 months to a year? I mean, is this Democratic administration, this Democratic legislature going to continue to benefit from the state being awash in money as compared to some of the other tougher subjects that you mentioned, Matt, such as right to work or gun safety? What do we think? What road do we think they're going to take?
Well, it was a fairly partisan set of proposals that were put forward. There was only a few things that were offered that are likely to generate Republican support. But historically, most laws still pass with bipartisan support. Most policies tend to eventually be negotiated to have some support from both parties. So there probably will be things under the radar, especially as we get later in the term, that do pass with more bipartisan support, and probably still some budget negotiations that end up with some Republican input. But definitely it's partly just about economic times. So, the research on State of the State addresses shows that governors almost always propose spending increases, Republican or Democrat. They get about 80% of what they ask for in those State of the State addresses. And it's just much more dependent on the state of the economy and the state budget than it is on state partisanship. So right after she got the momentary applause from Republicans on the earned income tax credit, she then stepped on it by saying a decade ago she was righting a wrong from a decade ago when they had to raise these taxes. But that was a different economic time. It isn't the case that previous governors wanted to raise taxes and decrease spending. That's what was made available to them by the state of state revenue.
And Charlie, certainly Michigan's economy is, as we know, not immune to outside forces and outside pressures.
Not at all.
We still have a war going on in Ukraine that the United States and its allies seem to be digging in deeper to. There's conflicts in almost every corner of the world. Supply chains are still not where they were before COVID. How do you see the future? If you look into your crystal ball 6 months from now, where are we going to be?
Well, I think 6 months from now, we're likely to be kind of close to where we are now. As I say, I think nationally, it's likely that we'll either have a very mild recession or not quite a recession. In other words, slow growth. Because Michigan, even after all the shrinkage of the automobile sector, even after all that shrinkage, we still are more heavily dependent upon durable goods manufacturing than the average state. And durable goods mean bigger ups and downs of the economy, because you can put off buying a car, you can't put off buying groceries. So it's likely to be, not a great time, not a horrible time. I keep, instead of looking at the next 6 months, just looking at the really big picture. For better or worse, Michigan prospered in the middle of the 20th century phenomenally with the manufacturing-based economy. That has shrunk, and we haven't done as much as some other places to replace it with high-tech, high-skill stuff. And so in 2021, which is the last year for which we have the data, we slipped a couple of notches to 34th among the 50 states in per capita personal income. And we've been in the 30s for the last more than decade. And I would love to see us skyrocket in the rankings, but that's unlikely as long as we're notably below the national average in terms of the educational attainment of our working population. So I think we're, muddling along, doing okay, but gangbusters growth is not something that I am anticipating. I wish I were, but I don't think so.
And we're moving in the wrong direction on that education front. New data showed that During the pandemic, there was about a 10 to 15% decline in Michigan high school graduates going on to colleges, primarily in community colleges, and we haven't recovered.
Right.
So we're still having fewer people go to college.
Lots of other states have that problem, but that's scant comfort to me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, certainly, despite the heady times on the dollar side, there are certainly some issues to work on to ensure economic growth into the future, as well as hopefully population growth. Any other thoughts as we close the show? Always a pleasure to have this discussion.
Well, since we're entering Valentine's season, I'll end on a stat I saw this morning in the Washington Post, which is that people who are born in Michigan are more likely to marry other people born in Michigan than that same pairing for any other state.
Is that right?
And one of the reasons is the bad news that we know, which is that there aren't a lot of people coming into Michigan from other states. But I think one of the other reasons is the good news that we don't tout as much, which is actually that our young people tend to stay in the state rather than leave for elsewhere. So I think all of us were born outside of Michigan, so we're the exceptions here. But Michigan has a lot of people who are born and stay and love here.
Well, it's great to know that Michigan is the nation's center for romance, and that'll make me feel good as we move into the Valentine's season.
And I think that's a good way to close this month's show. Again, my thanks to Russ White and the staff here at MSU Audio Studios for their support of this program. Charley and Matt, always a pleasure. And to